بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لم تقولون ما لا تفعلون كبر مقتا عند الله أن تقولوا ما لا تفعلون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Elders, uncles, sisters, brothers, friends, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yesterday we started talking about the theme that we will follow over these nights. The idea is that we want to help ourselves understand, make sure, maximize our chances of doing what we want to do, doing the right thing, getting the result in the end. And we discussed yesterday that there are barriers to that. So knowing what is right is not, while it's necessary, it's not in itself, it's not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. It is required that you know what the right thing is, but that in its own right doesn't make you do the right thing necessarily. There are barriers, there are biases, behavioral biases. And I promise to expand on these and talk about them. And these are extremely relevant. For a long time, experts believed that humans are rational individuals. Essentially, if you were to provide a human being with all the necessary input, all the necessary information, then you will get consistently the correct outputs. Essentially, all you needed is to educate. All you needed is to provide information. So people do wrong things because they don't know what is right, because they lack something in their knowledge. And if we teach, they have the knowledge, they will make the right decisions. Except they don't. Except there is a lot of evidence which shows that people knowing the right information still make incorrect decisions. Sometimes they make irrational decisions. So there is this gap. And this stems from understanding the reasons behind it, the mechanisms, and how we can help ourselves will help us in our daily lives, in our financial decisions, in our business decisions, in our where we live and what we study, and families and relationships. But ultimately, and most importantly, it would help us on the Day of Judgment. Would help us act in the way we know we should act. And so to understand our minds, how we work, recent research, this is kind of pioneering research, started in 1979 and continued into the 80s and 90s, and as I mentioned yesterday, received the Nobel Prize in 2002, Nobel Prize for Economics. It's this behavioral aspect. And so one way of putting it, the words here don't really matter. You know, it doesn't really matter if you remember system 1, system 2, but what matters is the concept that in our minds, there are two states. There's a state that researchers called system 2, which is logical, rational, deliberate, where you consider the information, you evaluate the evidence, you look at what is right and what is wrong, and you make a calculated decision. An example of which is you, under exam conditions, assuming you've prepared well and it's an exam you're going to pass, but that's the kind of situation. An example of which is you calculating probabilities, you designing a building, you making a conscious decision about something. When you sit and think and take the time and reflect, and then you make a decision. This is where we get it right usually. This is where we make correct decisions because we look at the inputs, we evaluate the outcomes, and we make decisions. And this is system 2. But there is another state of mind, referred to as system 1, where we make decisions more on basis of intuition, what feels right, what seems right. And this is an example of, so while system 2, as I mentioned earlier, is deliberate and effortful, so that's you learning to drive. This is your instructor saying, this is the steering wheel, this is the brake. You kind of press here to slow down, you press here to speed up. Make sure you look at this sign, you do that. That's system 2, training. System 1 is after you've been driving for a long time, where you get in your car without thinking, you know how to start the engine, you know how to drive forward, you know how to eat. Do you think, how do I hold a spoon when I eat? But when you look at a 2-year-old eating, I happen to have a 2-year-old, they struggle to control the spoon very well. So what happened in that transition? We are born with some inbuilt neurons that teach us basic things, reflexes. Beyond that, we learn. And this is a powerful and very important mechanism Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us to make our lives so much easier. So what happens is we evaluate things, we learn, and so that's system 2. And then once something, essentially we have a switch in our brains. If we do something once and again and again and again and again, our body knows, our brain knows, this is something we do repetitively. So why do you have to think about it every time? It doesn't make sense to put in the same effort every time. The switch is triggered and you create an autopilot. You create a system where essentially you just follow the procedure without thinking about it. It's very fast, it's very intuitive, it's good most of the time. The key word here is that it's good most of the time. The problem is, it's not good all the time. So that's concept 1, which I spoke about yesterday, and I just wanted to refresh your memories. Concept 2 is context. So in a rational world, we all make decisions based on inputs. And so it doesn't really matter. This is the assertion that regardless of context, people who have the right information will make the right decisions. But there is a lot of evidence that shows actually context makes a lot of difference. So when you take the time to reflect and think, you can make the right decision, but under pressure, when stressed, when whether it's time pressure, whether it's emotional pressure, whether you're processing a lot of information, whether there is an overload, we tend to make some mistakes there. Essentially, when we are under pressure, system 2 cannot cope. System 2, by the way, is a bit like your old computer. When you open a few programs, it chokes. You know how it does, and it starts to stop loading, and you wait and nothing happens? That's system 2. So what's our default? We switch to system 1 and do something. We don't freeze like our computers do. We just do something intuitive. And that intuitive thing is correct most of the time, but is disastrously wrong sometimes. And this is where the problem lies. It's in that gap between knowing what we should do and actually doing it. Right? And so this is the gap that's very important to talk about and to bridge. And context plays a big role which situation we go in, which mode we activate, whether we use system 1 or system 2. And this is the reason why people often think they know the right thing. They are okay. When you ask them in a normal state of mind, they will give you all the right answers. But when they're stressed, they do something very different. Let me give you some examples. A Western philosopher A long time ago it says that I can turn any human being into an animal. He was asked, how can you do that? What he means by that is from rational to irrational. He says, well, all I need to do is just to punch them in the face. I'll go and punch someone in their face, they will punch me back. His argument is, maybe I punched you in the face for a good reason. Maybe I was pushing you away because there is something behind you that's about to hit your head. I was doing you a favor. Maybe I punched you in the face because there is a dangerous, poisonous insect, venomous insect that was on your forehead that I was killing. Or maybe I was just assaulting you. But imagine the scenario, somebody punches you in the face, you stand and think, well, why did they do that? I'll look around, I can't see an environmental reason why they did that. Let's have a debate, why did you punch me, let's discuss. And then after 5 minutes you think, well, actually, I'm not convinced of your reasons, I'm just going to punch you in the face now. Do we ever do that? We react. Because usually it's okay to react. In fact, it's very beneficial to react quickly. If you're being attacked by a lion, and you say, well, let me analyze the situation. Let me just stand here and think about it, evaluate all the options, and then act, you probably get eaten. So what you do, you run. That mechanism is very important. What's the problem with that mechanism? Is that experts sometimes say if you're faced with an animal, you should hold your ground. You look more scary and more scary to the animal and a little bit less like food, because their food runs usually, so they chase it. If you run, you look like food, they chase you. But in that moment, how many of us actually remember that? How many of us actually stand their ground when they need to? So in a cold state of mind, you ask them to say, yeah, I know that. I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. If, I don't know, if there's a big dog and it's running towards me, I just need to stand. But when the dog is coming running towards you, it's a very different situation. Context matters. Now, am I talking about animals attacking us? Not really. Because there are so many examples, and I'll be touching on these every night, where context can make all the difference in our decisions. Context doesn't just affect us when we are scared. Scared is one example. Mental load is another example. One study, there are lots of really interesting kind of pieces of research on this. One study asked people to kind of remember a very long number in their heads versus a short number in their heads. And when they tried to memorize a 7-digit number, they started to make many more mistakes like these. Simply, they just started to say, my brain can't cope with this. I'm focused so much on remembering the long number, I'm just going to revert to my system 1, the intuitive stuff. Same when we're challenged with a situation, whether it's fear or whether it's attraction or whether it's desire or whatever. There are so many examples of this. So context matters. And on context, I want to kind of mention a couple of terms here that are relevant. Essentially, it's referred to as the hot state of mind and the cold state of mind. Essentially, when you make a decision, as you are making the decision, that's when the lion is running towards you, that's a hot state of mind. You are making the decision now. When you are thinking and intellectualizing it and talking about it like I am now, that's a cold state of mind. So cold state of mind is when you're not making a decision. Hot state is when you are. The problem is most people know what to do in the cold state, but when they go to the hot state, they start to use shortcuts and get it wrong. So context matters. Thirdly, expertise, knowledge makes a difference. So you can train yourself. You can, with efforts and the right methods, you can convert information, transfer them from system 2 to system 1. Essentially make the right decision more intuitive. And I gave the example yesterday of a trained driver. They know when the car is skidding not to brake, but everybody else continues to brake because we are scared, and we don't do what our instructors tell us, is that when your car is skidding, take your foot off the brake. We can't do that, but an expert driver can do that. Same with kind of an ER physician, I guess, under situations of stress. Same with a soldier when they are under threat. If they're trained well, they know how to react. Let me give you an example. In the US, a few years ago, there was an incident where there was a fire in a house. So the fire was raging, the fire brigade arrived, they walked into the house, they found the fire in the kitchen. So they started to put out the fire, pretty much gained control of it, almost, doing a good job, almost job is done. Then the chief in charge of the situation had this strange sense of danger. That's how he puts it. Something felt wrong, something is not right. And he called his team to just run out of the house as quickly as possible. They're in control. The rational system too says, all is well. This is a kitchen, there is fire here. Obviously the fire is in the kitchen and we're controlling it. His argument was, at the time, on the spot, was the floor feels a little bit warmer than usual. Something feels wrong about the floor. I don't like it. Moments later or minutes later, the house collapsed. The fire actually wasn't in the kitchen, it was in the basement. The house was about to collapse because everything else is burnt, and it had spread from the basement to the kitchen. Now, how did he make that judgment while his team didn't? Because he was trained. He's an expert. And there is a lot of evidence to show that experts can are less likely to get it wrong when in times of need. Now, why does this matter? This matters because we every day face decisions. Our interest here is in making the right decision. And so if we can either modify our behavior, train ourselves, condition our brains so that we can act in those moments of difficulty, in those hot states, act correctly, that can be very, very beneficial. Alternatively, if we know that we can't cope with the situations, we can prevent ourselves from being in those situations. And this is very relevant. So these three key concepts, please try and remember them. 1, there is system 1 and system 2, deliberate versus intuitive. 2, hot state versus cold state, when you make a decision versus normally when you think about it. And 3, so that's context matters, number 2. And number 3, expertise, training, helps. Now you'll notice over the days that I'll give you examples from academic research and from religion, from the Quran, from the stories of Ahlul Bayt. And there's a very good reason for that. I actually have 2 reasons for that. One is, we as the followers of Ahlul Bayt are followers of logic and rationality. They teach us to take knowledge wherever it comes from. And it's very important that we do. And we accept it with an open mind. That's who we are. But secondly, and this is a crucial point, this stuff that has been known in this particular example, the importance of behavioral aspects of our thinking, may be known well for the past 10, 12 years. Research started maybe 30 years ago, 35 years ago. So people 100 years ago had no idea how to make decisions, didn't know about these quirks of the system of our brains. But I'll give you lots of examples to show you that religion addressed these, Quran addressed these, Ahlul Bayt addressed these a long, long, long time ago. Why is this important? Is it to say, I told you so? No, not really, not at all. But to alert you to something else. What other knowledge that we don't know about today, but we'll know about in 50 years, that's also buried in religion? Essentially, I want to get across to all of us that religion is designed for a reason. These followers of Ahlul Bayt 1400 years ago and 500 years ago and 100 years ago benefited from the results of this research before knowing this research. And there is so much more that we benefit from without us knowing. And so it's silly to go and kind of challenge every little aspect because it doesn't seem to make sense. Or to say there's a new piece of research now that we found out, let's change our religion to fit. Because maybe that other piece will be explained in 30 years. You don't want to remove things that will be explained in the future. Benefit from them now. And then when in the future they're discovered, that's great. So it's very, very important for us to focus on the evidence, look at why we are the followers of Ahlul Bayt, and once we get there, and once something is proven to be a verse in the Quran or a narration from one of the Ma'soomeen, one of the infallibles, then we accept it and benefit from it. It's a blessing, it's a great thing that we have. Let me give you an example of this hot state, cold state of mind from the Quran. We've all heard of the Battle of Badr. Battle of Badr happened in the year 2 Hijri. It was an army, a much larger army of Meccans attacking the Muslims in Medina. The battle raged, and the Muslims, under the leadership of the Prophet, won it. And Imam Ali alayhi salam had a major role in it. As you know, half of those who were killed on the other side, half of the damage to the disbelievers was done by Imam Ali, the other half by all the remaining Muslims. And it was a very important victory early on. And so before that date, the Prophet had been telling the Muslims the importance of jihad, that they need to fight for Islam when needed, to follow their leaders when needed, and they accepted it and they think it's all great. Cold state of mind, all is well. Came the Battle of Uhud. The Prophet, and before that, before the Battle of Uhud, they used to tell the Prophet, we want to fight, we want to be your soldiers, we want to be involved in those victories, we want to be part of the victory, and if not, we want to be martyrs in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they were very sincere. They weren't people who didn't know what was right and wrong. They knew exactly what they were saying, and they really meant it. Came the Battle of Uhud, as you know, and the Prophet organized his army in an innovative way at the time, in an important, layered, ranked way, put some of them on that mountain, the mountain of Uhud, which was behind him, to protect them from counterattacks. The battle was going very well. It was almost a victory. Then some of his fighters said, well, it's done, we've seen this before, we know what it's like, let's just go down and collect some of the wins, some of the artifacts that were left by the retreating army, the opposing army. And then the whole thing turned. The famous story of Khalid ibn al-Walid going behind the mountain, attacking the Muslim army from the back, and it reached a situation where the Prophet himself was in grave danger. His face was cut, his teeth were damaged, and had very, very few people fighting next to him who stood and fought when times were difficult. What happened there? What happened was people knew what they were supposed to do, but when things got really hard, they had a situation in their minds that if I don't run now, I'll get killed. So I'll run. In the cold state of mind, they said, well, if I should defend and that will bring victory, and if I don't succeed in my defense and I get killed, that's fine, because it's a win-win situation. Victory or heaven, that's fine. But when they got scared, things were very different. And as a result, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, conveyed these verses that I started off with from Surah As-Saff. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the situation. So it starts with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Sabbaha lillahi ma fis samawati wa ma fil ardi wa huwa al-azizul hakim. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu lima taquluna ma la taf'alun. Kabura maqtan 'inda Allahi an taqulu ma la taf'alun. Inna Allaha yuhibbu alladhina yuqatiluna fi sabilihi saffan ka'annahum bunyanun marsus. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking to the believers, those who know. These are believers, right? They're convinced of the story, they're not others. You believers, why do you say what you do not do? Why is there a disconnect between what you claim you know and what you actually do on the day when it matters, on the day of the battle. كَبُرَ مَقْتًا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ. It's gravely hated, loathed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you say what you don't do. There's a disconnect between what you know is right and when you claim to be right and your actions. So this is an example of this phenomenon. When people know what they should do, they understand what they should do, but they actually don't act on it. And it has very serious consequences. In that case, almost a dead prophet. A lost battle ended up in stalemate. It wasn't lost, but it made a huge difference, which because of the energy the disbelievers gained from that battle, they came in a year later. This happened in the year 3, the year 4 Hijri. There was another major battle, and there were problems and problems and problems which led to loss of life, which led to loss of resources, distractions, wounds, all sorts of major problems. Because in a moment of weakness, under pressure, they buckled. And that's all the difference. All the difference. It's very easy to have 1,000 people agree with you when they are calm and collected. But at crunch times, how many do? We often in days like these in Muharram speak how almost, from a position of arrogance, we look at these Kufans and say, you idiots, you had the chance to support the Imam and you gave up. Only like 70 something of you did. There were many in prisons, there were many killed, but many thousands didn't. Because it's so easy, right? It's so easy when you're sitting here in the luxury of time and say, well, I can analyze it, I can look at the evidence and it makes sense to me this way. But when you actually stand there and the arrows are flying your way, that's when it counts. And that's why we need all the training, all the thinking that we can get when things are, when we're able to. And that's why we need to kind of learn as much as possible now in the cold state so that we are as ready as possible when we need to make the decision in the hot state. So one of those key aspects of quirks that have a major impact on our lives, quirks in our thinking, biases as they call them, that have a major effect on our lives and on our religion, something called time inconsistency. And it's related a lot to self-control, which is very relevant religiously. Time inconsistency means simply this, that when you make a decision today about tomorrow, you make a different decision than when you make a decision a week from now, say, based on the day after. It's all the same ratio, the same thing, but you discount the future, you think of the future differently. In other words, if I was to say, I'm going to give you a present, I'm going to give you $100 now, or $105 in 2 weeks, you will say $100 now. If I say $100 now or $110 in 2 weeks, you'll say $100 now. Actually, research shows you would say approximately $115 in 2 weeks for it to be the same. But when you ask it with a different time frame, say, I'm going to give you $100 either a year from now or a year and 2 weeks from now, you see it's the same distance. The only thing I changed is whether it's now or future, you will only want $3 difference. So 3% becomes 15%. And it makes all the difference in our decisions. And this is really important. There's a study, any psychologists here would have heard of, many others probably would have heard of, the famous marshmallow study that you might have come across. It was research done in I think it was 1970 exactly, late 60s, early 70s, in Stanford University. These researchers, what they did, they brought in kids. It's called the marshmallow study because they gave them marshmallows, but they actually also gave them cookies and pretzels. They gave them a choice of their favorite treat. They asked them, what do you like to eat? They said, well, this. They said, okay. You can either have one now or two in 15 minutes. One now or two in 15 minutes. And these kids were 3.5 to about 5.5 years, just a bit, I think 5 years, 8 months. So one treat now, 2 treats in 15 minutes. Some kids chose, a lot of them chose one now. Some kids, however, about a third, chose 2 in 15 minutes. Okay? Time moves on. Years later, these kids were followed in their life up until the 90s, up until recently. So these kids, they were kind of between 3 and 5 in 1970. So they were born in the late 60s. They're still alive. And there was something really interesting. Those kids that were patient, that chose 2 treats in 15 minutes, are far more successful today than the kids who were impatient. Those kids who managed to understand the importance of time and adjusted correctly made much better financial decisions. They're happier in their marriages. They went to better universities. They got better jobs. They have a higher income. Like, seriously? It's a very small thing, you would think. Why does it have such an impact? And so there are kind of 2 interesting observations that came out of this study and other studies. One is that we see rewards. We basically overestimate the importance of now and underestimate the importance of the near future. If I give you a choice, we become very, very, very impatient now, not 15 minutes later. Right? And secondly, we perceive ourselves differently. So when we make our decisions about ourselves now or ourselves in the future, we make very different decisions. Let me give you an example. One study, they brought in researchers. They told them, today we're going to give you some food. In a month, you'll come again, we'll give you some food. Okay? What would you like in a month? You have 2 choices. You can have chocolates or an orange. Chocolates, nice to have, immediate gratification, good reward, but kind of bad for health in the long run. Orange, less rewarding now, but better consequences in the long run. So chocolate, orange, choose. What would you like to have in a month? So, okay, I can think about it. I want an orange. The majority said they wanted oranges in the future. It's better for them. It's healthier for them. I said, okay. So we're going to give you some reward now as well. Today, what would you like to have? Okay, for today, give me chocolates. But in the future, I'll be good. Now, why is this important? This is a bit like, I want a diet. I want to be on a diet from tomorrow. I want to give up smoking tomorrow. I'll start praying tomorrow. I will be good to my parents after I finish this fight. I'll, be nice to my children when I calm down, or I'll kind of help the poor when I'm rich. There's so much inconsistency. We predict our actions when we are in a different state, very different to the way we predict them now. Why is this important? Because one fundamental part of religion is based on us controlling our actions now for reward in the future, on the day of judgment, when it really mattered. And what do? We forget. We make many decisions about rewards that are very small now instead of very big rewards on the day of judgment. That's also a time inconsistency. By the way, let's agree, we all agree, we're all here because we believe in the day of judgment. We believe this life doesn't end when we die, right? It's not about knowledge. There's no knowledge gap, we know. We know that we will live, our actions will count, one day will come, we'll die, we'll go to another life, where our actions will not count anymore, we don't have the chance to make actions, and we will face the consequences, and there will be reward and punishment. There's no lack of knowledge whatsoever. And when you sit every single one of us and say, would you like some haram money now, some haram food now, some haram drink now, and be punished, or would you like to do this or that good deed and get huge, huge, huge reward on the day of judgment? I would argue without fail, we will all choose the reward on the day of judgment. But when it comes to our lives, Context, remember system 1, system 2, context matters. When we are in that state of mind, faced with that peer pressure, maybe, desire, maybe, and our brains are distracted, we have too many things, we make the wrong things time and again, time and again, time and again. And so we need some remedies, right? There's no point just talking about the problem, describing the problem. How do we solve it? How can we help ourselves make those decisions correctly when they matter? So one kind of the first, I'll talk about 6 different things we can do. So first of all, there are 2 obvious approaches. One is prevention, the other one is cure. If we understand, this is the point of me talking about it, if we understand our weaknesses, if we understand the situations where we fail, maybe we can just prevent ourselves from being in those situations. If I know that right now what is right and wrong, and I know that when I'm faced with that decision to make in the hot state, I'll crumble, well, maybe I can plan ahead. I can choose a different path. I can do something else. If I know that I am not so good a driver, and that road is very dangerous ahead of me, and when I'll be faced with, I don't know, a big lorry coming my way, I'll panic. I know that. So maybe I should choose a different route. That's one way of solving the problem. Religious examples, so many. This is why, and I'll talk about this another night in detail, when it comes to relationships, Islam puts the line very, very early on in controlling interaction, for example. This is why, if you know yourself that you may slip up in a situation, doesn't have to be attraction, could be many other things, don't go there. If you know you cannot face up to peer pressure, change your friends or change the context. If you know when you go with these friends to a restaurant and they serve food that's not halal and you will not be able to sit there without eating, well, go to a different restaurant. Religiously, you're not allowed to go in the first place. The prohibition begins earlier. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created these brains and He knows how we behave. So He says, don't put yourself in that situation. You are not permitted to put yourself in that situation and say, well, I couldn't help it. So you take action early on. Or you do something about it. This is the prevention, that's one way. Or you just take actions. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught His Prophet these concepts. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam once sent a group, a battalion for a battle. They came back. Think about it. You have just come back from war. War. Which means you could have died, you haven't died, you might be wounded, you might have an injury that will kill you in a few days. Right? It's a very serious frame of mind. You've just come back from war. Like, what is bigger than that? You're tired, you took a big risk, you've done something very, very important. And the Prophet welcomed them. He went out to receive them on the borders of the town of Medina and welcomed them and said, welcome to those people, to a group of people that have completed the minor jihad. You wouldn't want to be told, having come back from war, that what you've done is minor. He tells them, welcome from those who've completed the minor jihad. Now it's the time for you to do the major jihad. That was minor? That was war. He says, yes, there is something far harder for you to do. And he talks about, so they asked him, what do you mean by that? What is the major jihad? He talks about jihad in nafs. Essentially, controlling system 1 in our example. That's what he talks about. Being able to say no when it matters. And this doesn't happen overnight. It requires a lot of training, a lot of effort, a lot of time. And when you do all of that, then you will get results. And so, for us to kind of overcome the time inconsistency, partly we need to think of the Day of Judgment. It needs to be vivid in our minds. Research shows if it's vivid in our minds, if we remember it, if we think about it, if we are reminded of it, then we're more likely to act accordingly. That's what research shows. What religion says? Go to graveyards, attend funerals, think of death. In the Quran, when you recite, there's so much information about the Day of Judgment. It's one of the most frequently cited concepts in the Quran. Judgment and heaven and hell and hereafter. Because if you remember it, it becomes easier for our brains, for System 1, to remember those. To kind of act on it, to become a bit more like an expert. So our judgment under pressure becomes more likely to be correct. And there are verses, I just want to draw your attention to a bunch of verses, but I wouldn't have time to kind of describe them in detail. But please, obviously recite the Quran, but just do me a favor and recite these verses and trying to imagine the situation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes, the Quran, one thing to say before that. The writer, the author, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Ultimate power in being concise and effective and efficient. What does it contain? فيه تبيان كل شيء تبيانا لكل شيء. It has explanations and descriptions and reasons for everything. Everything. How big is it? This big. You can carry it. How much knowledge is contained in this? Every letter is there for a reason, right? We give that much credit to Shakespeare, we give that much credit to our authors, never mind Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's there for a reason. Yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dedicates verses and verses and verses describing the events on the Day of Judgment. Not just saying it will be a difficult day, full stop. Describes it. Because that's a mechanism by which, it's called availability heuristic, it's a mechanism by which we remember things. And so please, you'll see Surah 39, Surah Al-Zumar, verses 68 to 75, describe that. Almost the whole of Surah Qaf, practically from verse 16 onwards, up until the end, describe judgment and that interaction and that thinking. And when we recite it, when we read it, we will remember it much more. And if I paraphrase just the key ideas, just to give you a flavor, I won't be able to go through the whole thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes what happens on that Day of Judgment. وَنُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ. And a trumpet is sounded. There's this amazing, loud, scary noise. Could be something hitting Earth, an asteroid. Could be a major earthquake, could be a sound. But something really intense that everyone in the heavens and on earth would swoon, would die. Then it's blown again, and everybody stands up, looking around what happened. It's the Day of Judgment. Then the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shines on earth. I'm just picking the key concepts here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shines on earth. Then the book is put down, and it's the Day of Judgment. Then the prophets are brought, and the witnesses, and then every soul is shown what you've done in the past. Then those who have done well, those who have done badly, those who have disbelieved are taken in groups to hell, and talks about how the doors of hell swing open and how they get asked, didn't you receive messengers? And they say, yes, we did. And they go into hell, and then on the other hand, those who have done well go to heaven, and how they are received, salamun alaykum. And the verses continue to describe in detail that sequence of events. And so if we remember and recall and think about that day of judgment, we are far more likely to remember it when we are making decisions. Pleasure now or pleasure tomorrow. Restricting, patience, controlling for now, stopping myself from doing something wrong versus the future. That's why in the teaching of Ahlul Bayt, patience, patience, patience is so much emphasized. That's why in the Quran, the word patience comes so many times. As-sabirun, as-sabirin, sabar, so many times, because patience is so important. Because it's all to do with self-control and time consistency. Please move forward, brothers, just to make some space for others coming. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So this is one way, which is to make it vivid in our minds, to take actions. Another, I'll leave this for another night to explain in detail, is context, environment, community, friends. They can make a difference in helping us develop those skills. So a community can change what gets transferred. Remember what I was talking about in the mechanism, what gets transferred from the logical, rational process? If we do it repeatedly, our brain thinks, okay, this is important, this happens all the time, I'm going to make it automatic. So if you surround yourself by the right people and you do it repeatedly, you're more likely, your intuition becomes more likely to be right. A bit like the fireman, whose intuition was right when it mattered. Thirdly, or fourthly, pick your battles. Remember the analogy of a computer that's struggling to process information? Don't overload your brain. We need to choose our battles. Let's not put ourselves in a situation where our desires push us to do something wrong, and we are under pressure, and we are with a group of friends, so there's peer pressure, kind of adding additional stuff to it, and we are in a moment of weakness, and, because you will crumble. Remember when people had to remember a long number in their heads, a 7-digit number, they start to make mistakes? These are all external pressures. So we need to appreciate our limitations. We're not invincible, and that's fine. We just need to know the limits. Another one that experts say is really, really important is to have rules. Don't use discretion. And this is extremely relevant to religion. They say if you say, look, I know the right thing. I know what is right. I understand it, and I will be better placed at the time of making a decision. I can make the right decision, right? I know it's me. I'm not going to set a rule and then stick to it, even though it's not optimal. I know in this case it doesn't fit, but I'm just going to follow it anyway. So I'm going to use my discretion. I'm going to have a rule that usually I don't do this, but I'm going to change it when I see fit. Experts say don't do that. Stick to them. Have some rules that are absolutely firm and non-negotiable. Remember wajibat and muharramat, things that are compulsory in religion and things that are prohibited in religion. Luckily for our great-great-great-grandfathers who were Muslim, they knew this stuff without knowing the science. They had procedures they had to follow without question, and so do we. Have rules which say you are not allowed to do that. Don't say in this situation there is. Don't make exceptions, there is no exception. And this is extremely important in training our minds the right way. And a final one, a sixth one, is to form habits. Form habits, they say. When you form habits, you create shortcuts, and those shortcuts become much easier to do. Habits such as coming here, dua kumail, praying on time. Habits. essentially what you're doing there is you're saying, instead of having to think about everything, some things will be automatic, some things will be intuitive, so that my brain has free capacity. Those limited resources, those precious rational resources, are available when they're needed. They're not wasted on things that are obvious. And so habits, good habits, are very important. And that includes these regular, you wonder then, why does religion have a Friday prayer and prayers every day at 3 times at least? Why in this number, in this sequence, in this style? I mean, one quick analogy, if I was to, we all know many verses in the Quran, but I just want to make this concrete, this idea of doing something right when you can, when you have the luxury. It becomes very important when you don't have the luxury of time. If I was to just pick on any of you now, just be horrible for a moment and pick on somebody and say, come and recite a verse here in front of everybody, now. Probably, we all know the verses, right? But probably if I ask you to recite Surah Al-Rahman, you'll probably get it right. If I ask you to recite Surah Quraysh, you might probably hesitate, make a mistake somewhere. Think about it. Why? Because Surah Al-Rahman, you say it so many times every day. It's automatic. The other one, you need to think. And under pressure, thinking shuts down, and you can't say it. You freeze. You want to try? Does anyone want to volunteer? No, not really. But it is very true. You see people when they know their lines, actors in theater, whatever, they know their lines. They stand there and suddenly they freeze, because that moment is very different. Actually, it's not so funny even, especially with the power of hindsight. But in the UK, the leader of the Labour Party, we have elections in May, so this is really crucial time. The leader of the Labour Party gave a speech recently. This is about 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago. In the major Labour conference, this is the time to pitch for election. It's really crucial, right? And he's confident, he memorized his speech. He gave his speech without a piece of paper to look more confident, and he forgot about a couple of pages and didn't realize. He forgot the financial crisis. He forgot a couple of other absolutely crucial, immigration I think was the other one. These are so important to the electorate, he completely forgot them. Now, of course the guy knew what he was doing, right? He's the leader of the party. He's given so many speeches before. But under pressure, in that moment, when it mattered, he forgot. And so, what he could have done, he could have held a piece of paper if he knows he can't do it. Could have asked somebody else to give the speech. He could have tried a bit harder, learned it a bit more. There are lots of ways to do it. But this could be, in the UK, analysts say this could cost him the elections and his future job as the leader of the opposition. So it's serious consequences. And the consequences, if we believe what we believe, the consequences we deal with are far greater than losing elections, right? Happiness on the day of judgment for many, 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 many years, or eternity, or sadness and pain and punishment. This is far, far, far more important than something transient. And we can do something about it. That's the message here. We can do something about it. And Imam Rida was asked about what would give us, just watch these words just to prove my point. What would give us a combination, what would combine, give us everything? The good, the benefits, the well-being of this life and the hereafter. They asked him for something that would work for both. Not for this life, makes me rich, not then will send me to heaven definitely. I want something for both. I want to win everything. He answered with 2 words. Khalif nafsik. Essentially, control your system 1. Khalif nafsik means go against your desires, go against what your nafs combines all these intuitive, natural, less rational parts of us with their good and bad, our desires, our arrogance, our greed, those traits, those attributes, this nafs, go against it. What he's talking about is develop a habit of saying no. While you can, develop a habit of saying no. When it matters, you will say no. And when you say no, you will make better decisions in this life, and in finances, and in war, and in peace, and in marriage, and in projects. That's good for this life. And far more importantly, you make much better decisions for the day of judgment. And so I'll talk about this another night. I don't have much time now, but it's funny how when it comes to worship, we want the least possible contribution with the maximum possible reward. Actually, history books there are so many examples where they go to the Imam and say, tell me something that's easy and gives a lot of reward. We really want to be efficient with that, right? The minimum, like, can I do it in a minute? Can I do it in a bit less? I just really don't want to do any more than what is absolutely minimum required. What those people and what we miss most of the time is the process is important. The training is important. Al-Imam al-Kadhim spent years in prison. Years in prison. He's an imam, right? Ma'soom. And he was heard in those years in prison many times. This is, by the way, narrated by his captors, those who used to keep an eye on him. They say, we used to hear him say, pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Says, oh Lord, you know that I used to ask you to give me time so I can dedicate my time for worship. I used to ask you to just give me a bit more time so I can worship you a bit more, to dedicate that time to you. And now that you've done, thank you. How did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do it for him? Put him in prison. That's what he's talking about. He's saying prison is a blessing because I used to have to do community things, help people, do things. I couldn't dedicate more time to this gratifying, fulfilling process of worship. That I can dedicate time to you. You know, do you see that it doesn't make sense on almost every intuitive level to us? He is happy that he's in prison so that he can have some time to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he's grateful. And Ahlul Bayt used worship to train their people. We often say, you know, these people stood on the day of Karbala, for example, and that's amazing. They did it. You know, they did it because they're amazing people, and so they were associated with Ahlul Bayt, and that's why they worshipped. This is one way of the story. Essentially, they are great people, and because of that, they understand the importance of worship. But there's a reverse arrow as well. If you think about it as an equation, there are two arrows. The other one is they became great because of their practice. They conditioned themselves. They learnt from their time with the Imams. There were many who spent time with the Imams. Not everybody managed to succeed. And you see this example in Ahlul Bayt. No, I'm not talking about the infallibles. The infallibles are another category. But in Ahlul Bayt, you see this repeatedly present in how they trained their companions, their family, to achieve, to deliver when it actually matters. On the eve of Ashura, historians say, what would you do at that night, right? You're going to battle. There's a few of you, tens, facing thousands. You're surrounded. You know it's the last night you have. And those companions of Imam Hossein, the whole camp, not just the companions in Ahlul Bayt, the whole camp dedicated that time to pray and recite the Quran and worship. And historians say that night there was a buzz, a hum coming out of that camp because there are so many voices overlapping with each other. That moment, that hot decision-making situation, they were so clear in their minds. The intuition was absolutely correct. They didn't have to rationalize the process. It was clear to them what they had to do. And they continued to do it into that night and on the day of Ashura as well. On the day of Ashura, you know the situation when the battle is raging, things are difficult, and then one of the companions looks to the sky and says to Imam Hossein, it's just prayer time. He's going to heaven, right? He's a martyr. There's no question that this guy is going to heaven, and he knows that. So he could just, he has until sunset. He can fight and die, and he knows he'll die before sunset. He says to Imam al-Hussein, Sayyidi ibn Rasulullah, it's prayer time, and I would like to die after I have prayed with you. And in that difficult situation, Imam al-Hussein says, yes, you're right, it's the beginning of its time. And they pray in that compact situation, arrows flying, and this guy stands in front of him, uses himself as a shield, because the other side didn't stop, they kept throwing arrows, and he used himself as a shield, and he didn't flinch, he didn't buckle, he didn't bend, he didn't move to protect himself from the pain of these arrows piercing his body, because he was in tune, he knew exactly what was happening. And the battle raged, and think of the family of Ahlul Bayt. Think of the example of Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. Sayyidah Zainab grew up with Imam al-Hussein. Her brothers are so close to her, right? She is the daughter of Fatima, the daughter of Ali, grew up with Hassan and Hussein, played as children, and she knows his role, and she is Zainab. She is special, right? And that bond, and she knows the value of Hussein in life, not just as her brother whom she loves, but knows him as the Imam of the time. Yet, the Imam is prepared to go to battle. She sees him pray, and the arrows keep coming her way, and the tent gets hit. And then after that, all the companions go one after the other, and there are none left. And then Ahlul Bayt go one after the other, and there are none left, including her own sons, including Ali al-Akbar, including Qasim, including Radi'. And then Imam al-Hussein goes to battle, and Zainab is watching. She's under that much pressure, under that much strain, under that much pain. And Imam al-Hussein goes to battle, and these people start to attack him, and it continues, and he's thirsty, and the sun is in the middle of the sky, and it's scorching hot, and there are screaming children, and there's so much pressure on her. And Zainab, in that moment in time, Zainab is calm and collected. And Imam al-Hussein falls to the ground. And Imam al-Hussein is bleeding. And Imam al-Hussein is about to be killed, and Zainab watches. And Imam al-Hussein is killed then, and she sees him. And Zainab, in those moments, goes next to the body of Imam al-Hussein and says, Allahumma taqabbal minna hadha al-qatil qurbanan liwajhik. In that moment, she says, oh Allah, to you we deliver this sacrifice. We've all done it for you. Despite all the sacrifices and the pain that I'm going through, I still have the clarity in the mind. And Zainab, after the battle, she had to look after the children, watch her tents burn, watch her children and her brother's children run with fire, burning their clothes. And they are scared and they're terrified, and she's looking after so much. And in that, on the eve after the day of Ashura, on the night of the 10th, after the battle, the night calms down. She managed to collect the family, put them in their tents, and Zainab remembers to pray the night prayer. But Zainab that night, historians say, she prayed it sitting down. She never forgot the importance of prayer to her. It was always important to her, but Zainab couldn't stand having gone through this much pain and difficulty. So Zainab still prays Salatul Layl, but she is sitting down, and so does Imam Zain al-Abidin, having witnessed everything, and so do the family of Ahlul Bayt. They cry and they worship. And they know where it all fits, despite the pressures, despite the difficulties, despite the situation. These are, brothers and sisters, are our guides. These are the examples that we can emulate. And Zainab is not infallible. But Zainab is so, so, so great that she can do this. Sisters, brothers, let us pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He may give us the clarity of mind, the wisdom, that we can act under pressure correctly. And if we can't, please let us pray that we don't have those situations. We don't have those rewards that we might not be able to cope with. Sometimes a challenge, a difficulty is a blessing, as a disguised blessing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making decisions easier for us because He knows we can't cope. So let us pray for all those in need, especially those amongst us in need, that may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them health, help them make the better decisions, give them patience when times are difficult, that we manage to make good decisions, correct decisions towards ourselves, our partners, our parents, our children, our community. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.